All right, we're going to go ahead and continue our program at this time. Our next speaker is Thomas Ledesma. He's a researcher at the Alamo that graduated from Holy Cross High School of San Antonio and went on to receive his Bachelor of Arts in History with a minor in education, as well as a Certificate of European Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Thomas has served in several roles since joining the Alamo team in 2018. As the site grows, so does the need for assistance with research projects and the curation of artifacts. Thomas joined the collections and curation team as a researcher in March 2023. He is committed to uncovering the stories that tie us together, from forming a deeper understanding of the Alamo to sharing the Alamo's 300-year history with visitors from all over the world. So please join me in welcoming Thomas to the Dallas Historical Society.
Thanks, sir. Well, thank you for that introduction, David. I appreciate it. And good morning, everybody. I got big boots to fill after that great presentation from Colby. I'm not just saying that because he's my boss either. But so today you probably saw the title of my presentation here, A Tussle over Tierra, Incognita, and thought, what the heck is this guy talking about? And I asked myself that same question while working on this presentation. But over my time at the Alamo, we get several questions. Colby mentioned some of the more funnier ones that we get. But people ask, how does a story connect into the bigger picture? Or people from around the world are asking, how does a story connect to me? And one of the things that we have the opportunity to do with the creation of the new museum, and even within our new Ralston Family Collection Center today, is connect the Alamo to a larger global story. And one of the things that I have an interest in is that early colonial period of the Americas, and finding out how the Alamo thread is weaved through that. And so today we're going to take a journey through time, and we're going to see how the Alamo eventually gets established. Now, there's many different pathways to get to that point, and some things you may be left out, and you may think, hey, what about that? Other things may be new information to you. So let's begin our journey. In 1513, 21 years after Columbus landed in the New World, a Spanish ship under the command of Ponce de Leon reached Florida. The Spanish had finally set foot above the Rio Grande. From their bases on the islands of Puerto Rico and Jamaica and Cuba, Spanish conquistadors yearned for an opportunity to push forward into the unknown, seeking wealth and unending fame. And one of these men, Hernan Cortez, would not wait much longer, and despite an ongoing quarrel with the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, who was actually his boss during the conquest of Cuba, he disregarded his orders to wait, gathered up men and supplies, set ships west, and embarked towards Mexico. Another governor in the Caribbean, Garay, he was the governor of Jamaica, was also seeking to solidify his own reputation. And he would also dispatch a flotilla of about 4 ships under the command of Alonso de Pineda to make sail toward Florida, but then follow the Gulf Coast down and confront Cortez and try to stop him from making any other large gains or claiming large swaths of territory within Mexico. Pineda completed his mission going along the Gulf Coast, making notes on brief encounters with the native peoples of Texas and Florida, and eventually he did reach Mexico and confronted Cortez, claiming that at the Rio de Panuco, Cortez couldn't go any further north. And basically Cortez's answer to that was, who are you? And I'm going to do what I want. So Pineda says, all right, he goes back up north, somewhere probably around the Rio Grande. He sets up camp, and he's killed during an encounter with Native Americans. Now, one thing that Pineda makes that is everlasting is this early map of the Gulf Coast. And he might not get back to Garay to make his report, but the map does make it. It's kind of hard to see, it's very faded, but what we see right here is going to be Cuba, Florida, coming down here. We have the Yucatan Peninsula, and then we have Tampico and Veracruz right around here. And this map will be the standard that people are going to be using for quite some time. Still fuming over the disobedience of Cortez, Governor Velázquez would dispatch his own man in an attempt to arrest Cortez, Panfilo de Narvaez. Now, Narvaez had a sizable force when he landed at Veracruz to try to capture Cortez, but catching Cortez by surprise was going to be lost. He had left a force on the coast, and they notified him of this attempt to capture him, so he turns around, confronts Narvaez, and one-on-one combat ensues. And in the end, Narvaez leaves without one eye. So he gets an eye poked out by a spear. And he gets pretty upset, as you can imagine. And he says, you know what, this guy is a radical, we have to stop him. And if I can't have the power of governors of Jamaica and Cuba enough to stop him, or a larger superior force, maybe I have to go to the crown directly. So he will pack up and go back to Spain to petition the crown and other royal authorities for authority to go back or send somebody else to stop Cortez in his expansion into Mexico. The response that Narvaez gets is not great. The crown says, we like winners, and he's conquering Mexico, and you lost, and we think that you might be disappointed over that. And not only do we ask you just to step aside, by the way, we're sending a ship to Mexico granting Cortez title to certain lands that he's conquered and a permit to continue his expansion west, searching for the coast of the Pacific Ocean. But Narvaez would make good on his time in Spain, and he'll put together a petition to hopefully find a settlement in Florida. And so he will get that later on. With his opponents thrown off for some time, Cortez continued his campaign from 1521 to 1522 against the Aztec Empire, and soon began to consolidate his power in Mexico. Reorganizing his forces, he began to look not north to where Garay had laid claim with his 2 agents that he had sent, but west to conquest the lands of the Tarascans in today's Michoacan. And we can see how the Spanish have already laid claim to the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean islands in there, and they're working their way west. As reports and conquistadors themselves arrive in Spain, along with loads of silver and gold and stories of vast territories, the ground begins to take notice of the growing power and resources at hand in this new land. To this point, royal authority was needed to venture into Mexico, yet direct oversight in the New World was virtually non-existent. Wanting to solidify royal authority across the ocean was a must. The resources were too great to be left in the hands of individuals who would disregard authority, such as Cortez had displayed earlier to both the governors of Cuba and Jamaica. First, the crown would reap the benefits of these agents for permits to explore and conquer. A fifth of the wealth discovered in the New World would have to be sent back to the crown as a payment for these permits. Then, to ensure that these permits and payments would be lawfully fulfilled, they decided to establish the office of the viceroy within the New World. The first viceroy in New Spain would be Antonio de Mendoza. Permits would be issued for all further expeditions. Cortez would be able to continue west, but just along the coastal regions. And during that time, it leads to the eventual formation of the Kingdom of New Galicia by a compatriot of Cortez, Nuño de Guzman, and the founding of the city of San Miguel de Culiacan. As I mentioned earlier, Narvaez would get his permit to explore Florida around the same time. In about 1528, he begins that quest to explore Florida. However, it's not Narvaez who becomes wealthy or famous from the venture in that region. He loses most of his men and even his own life. Yet one survivor will gain promise from this misadventure, and that's Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, probably a name that most of us are familiar with. De Vaca's survival ordeal would take him across the Gulf states, through Texas, and eventually back into Mexico. His written account would spur interest toward the large swath of territory in the north, a vast region stretching from Florida to New Mexico today. In his account were recollections of well-established native communities, and in the part he mentioned the talk amongst natives of large cities to the north and west, where gold could possibly be found. It is a fascinating account, and is a must-read to anyone that's interested in those early expeditions in the American Southwest and the Gulf states. And here we have those 3 main players in the beginning. On the far left, we have Pánfilo de Narvaez, Cortez in the middle, and the Viceroy Mendoza. And Mendoza, again, will go in there to try to steer the ship and implement royal policy on colonization in the New World. While De Vaca was recuperating and beginning to tell his tale, after this journey we can see here. And if you're curious on what language that map is in, it's in German. It's one of the best maps that I could find on the internet, and it does a great job of showing that route that the expedition takes from Florida back into Mexico. In 1533, the ruler of New Galicia, Nuño de Guzman, would attempt to control the corridor from the important city of Guadalajara in the west to the Panuco River in the east, with the goal of linking the two coasts together, the Pacific and the Atlantic, since setting a line of division between the Kingdom of New Spain and that of a new expanded New Galicia, and that possibly may shift the power structure in Mexico and allow for control of any further operations to the north. Again, at this time, expeditions have been going west and up the coast. The midsection of Mexico is still relatively unexplored. As you can imagine, the Crown and its agents in Mexico, mainly the Viceroy Mendoza, could not let that stand. A new established state being controlled by a conquistador on his own is not something that the Crown is interested in at this point. And so letters were sent out from Spain, back into New Spain, to the Viceroy saying that Guzman was to be replaced as governor of New Galicia. The Viceroy would ensure that any establishment of this new kingdom under its new governor would be subservient to the Crown and its goals. And with this, he now had a clear road north and inward. Cortez, by these new royal permits, was still only committed or allowed to explore the coast. And so now this upper section of Mexico was available for exploration. The only other permit going on at this time would be De Soto's adventure into Florida. And so all Mendoza needed to explore this other region of Mexico would to find a willing captain to take on an expedition. And at this time, one of the ways that the Crown is kind of saving money is the royal authorities are not bankrolling any of these expeditions. It's up to the conquistador, the explorer themselves, to gather the resources, the funds, the men, the ships, pay for a permit, sometimes even putting down several $1,000s worth of insurance to say, oh, De Soto, you're going to Florida? If you decide in Cuba you don't want to go anymore, well, you have to pay us $15,000. And so that's going to be an encouragement for them to go. And we'll see a shift in that later on. This expedition would not necessarily be like the ones that happened before. Those royal reforms stated that sponsored expeditions could not only contain military assets, but also must contain a religious contingent. Many of the men that experience in these uncharted lands were not interested in becoming Mendoza's agent, or possibly seen as competition, like De Soto or Cortez. But eventually a captain was found, and this would be the newly appointed governor of New Galicia, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. To lead the religious contingent would be a religious member, the Fray Marcos de Niza. De Niza did have some experience along the Rio Grande region and the New Mexico border, and at one point he had claimed to see from a distance this vast city that he referred to as New Cibola. Now the issue with de Niza is, didn't quite see what he said he did. And it begins to stir the pot on what's possibly above the Rio Grande. Before he could even get approval, Mendoza takes all this information, his willing captain, his religious contingent, puts together a pretty large expedition, about 1,500 people. A lot of folks don't realize that the Coronado expedition was quite large. And they begin forth to go into New Mexico. Now, keeping an eye on competitors wasn't the only reason that Coronado's expedition went up the coast. Of course, logistically, you use the Sea of Cortez to drop off supplies and reinforcements if needed, but it's also the geography of Mexico. Looking at this map, we can see that there's the mountain range here that's going to push these adventurers up the coast. Again, you have the sea here to resupply, and this is really the furthest extent of any major settlements besides Culiacan up to the north. This is very much a small outpost. And we also have to think about the people who are living in this region that's highlighted in yellow, known as the Gran Chichimeca. Now, when Guzman over here decides that he's going to go make New Galicia before he's kicked out, he stumbles upon Native Mexican peoples living in this area and begins what is known as the Mixton War. And it will be a very brutal affair. It's quite short, but it's a brutal affair. and the Quexactan people would be subdued, and then it opens up this corridor to the north. Again, at this time, most of the expeditions are focused on Florida and the western coast of Mexico. So from 1540 to 1542, Coronado would explore the lands that would become modern-day New Mexico. And this is one of the famous Remington paintings of Coronado's expedition. I love this one. All kinds of folks in here. You have native Mexicans coming up on this expedition, the religious folks, and of course, other adventurers and conquistadors and potential settlers headed north. And this is another great map showing those routes of where Spanish explorers are going at this time. He would go into modern New Mexico, Texas, and even Kansas. Eventually, Coronado would return south. De Soto's time in Florida was just as a harrowing experience as Coronado's in the West. His company would explore what would become modern-day Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even Arkansas. But unlike Coronado, De Soto would not survive to report on his journey. He would die and be buried somewhere along the muddy banks of a river charted a little bit earlier called the Rio del Espiritu Santo, which is the Mississippi River. His company would continue on without him, eventually reaching the borders of modern-day Texas. But despite these great efforts on both of the expeditions, no great city of Cibola or others were found, wealthy in gold or other resources during these two expeditions. Yet the Spanish designs on both Nueva Mexico and Florida were not over. Now, due to these unsuccessful adventures, a shift did occur, thanks to the discovery of silver much closer to home. I mentioned earlier at the end of the Mixed-In War that Central Valley becomes open in Mexico. And so now explorers are going to be venturing forth into there. Taking advantage of the peace following the Mixed-In War and having to look elsewhere for opportunity, men like Captain Juan de Tolosa decided to take a gamble at what lay to the north of Mexico City on the Grand Central Plateau. His expedition would soon find a rich vein of silver. Settlements and those looking to capitalize soon moved in, and a city was established. And that's going to be the city of Zacatecas, which for a very long time, even today, is very rich in mineral wealth, of course, in veins of silver. To that point, it was the richest deposit of silver and gold found since the Aztec conquest. So you can imagine it's been years since Cortez made his famous conquest of Mexico City. People have ventured all the way north into New Mexico and other states. Florida has not shown anything. De Soto is not looking for the Fountain of Youth, by the way. Not true story. And what's going to happen? Where's next? Was that it? Is everything gone? And then Zacatecas is founded. The arrival of the Spanish to this region was not uncontested, of course, and another war with natives would erupt throughout the region known as La Gran Chichimeca. This war came about for several reasons: encroachment of the new settlers into the region, harsh treatment by the Spanish, and also raids by the Chichimeca and Zacatecos on the settlements and mining operations in this region. These people were a fierce adversary, and in some accounts it even mentions that the Zacatecos may have been some of the first mounted adversaries that the Spanish had faced in the New World. And they put up a heck of a fight. And it got to the point where the Spanish authorities approved the highest extent they could for a strategy in the war, which they labeled sangre y fuego, blood and fire. From the 1550s to about 1585, this strategy was carried out to the letter. But one lasting element of the strategy was the establishment of frontier presidios along these rarely populated areas and flying companies that could go out and respond to emergencies on the frontier. Now, this strategy of blood and fire had its successes and failures. But by 1585, the Spanish court looked for a more peaceful solution. There is a shift if you look overall at the timelines of this age of conquest and this age of exploration. And this is kind of the beginning of marketing campaigns. The Spanish are saying, maybe we want to shift away from this conquering image and talk about a more peaceful way to consolidate these lands. And in 1542, just prior to the breakout of the war, the sovereign over Spain, Charles V, had issued forth new laws for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians. And later on, in 1573, Philip II also issued new ordinances within the law of the Indies for the discovery, the population, and pacification of the Indies. These types of laws were gaining momentum once again, a sure sign of the religious establishment's influence in the court. Of course, today we always think of this joint venture of military expeditions in the New World under the Spanish along with the religious contingent. And that necessarily wasn't always the case, and they definitely always butted heads. Peace by purchase was now officially replaced Blood and Fire by the Third Mexican Provincial Council of 1585. And a new viceroy, Alvaro Manrique de Zuniga, would take over and implement this. A new chapter in Spanish-Native relations began. And here we have our good friend Charles V and later on Philip II. Now, to this point, we focused on Spanish movements along the Gulf, across the western coast of Mexico and up north. And now in the story, we see that the Spanish have secured a foothold in the northern central plateau. Not quite the Rio Grande, but we're getting there. To the east, across the Gulf Coast, they would need to solidify their hold on Florida. To this time, no major cities have been established. There is a kind of a loose presence of Spanish forces around there, usually by the way of naval patrols. But one of their strategies for defense in the New World is to ensure that the Gulf of Mexico remains essentially a Spanish lake. And they will pass laws outlawing other nations incurring into there. Now, in 1563, a flotilla under the direction of Admiral Gaspar de Coligny and his right-hand man, Jean Ribault, arrived off the coast of Florida. And we can see that this is one of the early maps that France has of the New World and what they're interested in. And you'll notice that Florida is quite large, all the way from what we think of Florida today down through Texas, all the way to the Rio Panuco. So basically, if you don't live in Tampico, you live in Florida. And we can see these individuals here that are a part of this expedition. Now, the goal of this Huguenot-led expedition was to create a refuge for these French Protestants that are escaping some persecution by the Catholic monarchy in France. Now, they decided on Florida because it was a prime location. You had access to the Atlantic Ocean on one side, you also had access to the Gulf on the other. And despite the several expeditions, about 11 up to that point, again, the Spanish had never established a solid presence there, whether that be a civilian settlement, a mission, or a fortress. And so they decided to drop off their settlers near the St. Johns River, which is modern-day Jacksonville. Several of the ships would return to France, and their goal was to drop off the first load of folks and then come back with more supplies, soldiers, and colonists. The first group that's left there gets to work, and they begin to create a new fortress in Florida called Fort Caroline. Now, finally, in June of 1565, René Gaulien de Laudonnière returned with more settlers and supplies. However, that time between the first initial drop-off to his return was very hard on the settlers there, and they had experienced what the Spanish explorers earlier had, that this was not a place you could just set up shop and be successful. It took a lot of hard work. They weren't supplied adequately enough, lack of food, disease, the tropical weather was paying its toll. And some even decided, to heck with this, and they went off on their own to start their own settlements or even to find the Spanish to get them out of Florida. Now, after a brief time of captivity in Europe, the chief leader of this group, Ribault, was also preparing to come back to this colony he had started in Florida. He got arrested by the English, he's held in captivity for a little bit, gets free and says, I have to go back to Florida. Now, with some of the folks that had left Fort Caroline, which we see here, and other folks getting arrested in England like Ribault and then talking to other folks, word spread pretty quickly that the French were up to something in Florida. And the King of Spain had been alerted to this news. And of course, word was sent to the Viceroy in New Spain. The French must be located, their plans disrupted, and any footholds they had established destroyed to make way for a more permanent Spanish presence. Now, the man chosen for this duty was Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles. Now, Aviles was already permitted to embark on an expedition to Florida. The Spanish were just on the cusp of sending his expedition to set up permanent settlements when he gets word that, hey, we're still going to give you the permit to do that. We actually may even throw you extra money. So now the Crown is stepping in and saying, we will fund you partially. You don't have to do it necessarily all on your own. But before you get to do any of that, you have to find the French and destroy their fort. So now it became a race. Who was going to make it to Fort Caroline first? Was it Ribault and his French reinforcements, or was it going to be Admiral Avilés? In August of 1565, sails were seen on the horizon near this desperate French colony. It would soon be clear that Ribault had arrived, but he would not be alone. Avilés was closing in on his objective. Now, during a brief naval battle, Ribault found himself on the losing end, and to save his ships, he ordered his forces to tack away from the engagement. And saving his small fleet, he began to regroup, but at the same time, a large hurricane swept in, battering both forces. Now, the French are kind of pushed out into the sea, and they have to regroup at sea, trying to go a little bit north. And some of them end up going south. But Menendez keeps control of his flotilla and is able to land them. And he establishes a settlement, one of the earliest continual European settlements in North America, St. Augustine. Now, he said, you know what? The French are probably expecting me to try to attack Fort Caroline by the sea. I'm going to go through the back door. And he decides to go overland. And so that's what Menendez will do. We see a wonderful depiction here of the battle at sea. And here we have the christening of St. Augustine. Now, and that's our Admiral Avilés over here. Now, Menendez would end up pushing his ground forces, like I mentioned, overland through the storm surf. The hurricane is still not completely gone, and eventually he comes upon an undermanned and underprepared Fort Caroline. And they round up any of the survivors they have, and they continually, for the next couple of days, come across the French that had been spread out, and it's a pretty brutal reprisal. Most of the French are killed. And that solidifies the Spanish hold in Florida for the time being. And here we see French prisoners brought before Avilés, and they're going ahead and destroying any remnants of any French settlement there. And so we have that going on. Now, we tend to think of Florida in the confines of its modern borders, but we must keep in mind that the size of Florida that I mentioned earlier was very big. It's very fluid. At one point, it reaches up to the eastern seaboard, right above into South Carolina, regions like that. Even the Chesapeake Bay at one point, the very southern end of the Chesapeake Bay is considered a part of Florida, all the way down to right above Tampico. Now, using a modern map, we can see with these points how large that would have been. Now, Menendez, because of his success, is granted that territory. They're saying you can colonize Florida. But one of the issues is that the geography is not correct. Menendez doesn't quite understand how vast this territory is. And at one point he claims from Florida to the Rio Panuco is only 80 leagues. So pretty manageable. I'll be near, main Spanish forces. We can get to each other pretty quickly. Well, in reality, that's about 450 to 600 leagues. So he's off by quite a bit. But that won't trouble him for too much longer because Menendez eventually will pass away. He would never live to try and give his hand at colonizing Florida. So now that they had felt secure in their holdings, the Spanish did, they held the Caribbean islands as Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Hispaniola, along with the peninsulas of Florida and the Yucatan. No enemies could venture into this region without being seen and without some warning being raised. Now, focus again shifted northward to Mexico. Florida was ceded over to a nephew of Menendez, but the nephew didn't have the same resources or acumen that Menendez had, so he wouldn't do much with Florida. And so the Spanish, again, are saying, we have a guy who has a permit for that, but what's happening back in the mainland? Now, the silver and other metal deposits that had found in Zacatecas had proven to be immense. The development of the region had survived the aforementioned Mixton and Chichimeca wars, and men such as Nuño de Guzman, Francisco de Ibarra, Luis de Carival de la Cueva, and Rodrigo del Rio de Losa had explored and went on to establish some of the modern cities that we know of and states in Mexico today, such as the Villa of Guadalajara, Sonora, Sinaloa, Chihuahua, Durango, San Martin, and Santa Barbara. Out of the list of these conquistadors and administrators, Luis de Carival would emerge as the marshaling force in this movement toward the north. And here we see a kingdom that he would establish called Nuevo Reino de Nuevo León, the predecessor to the modern Nuevo León state. He had distinguished himself in naval service and been granted the post of alcalde or mayor of Tampico. But along with this post in Tampico, a request was made of Carival. He had to make a road that would lead from the silver mines in the central heart of the nation to the coast for transport back to the mainland. Now, if he did that, he would be able to colonize whatever territory he wanted to next. And he was successful at that. He made the road from Zacatecas to Panuco, and the crown granted him this large swath of territory. Again, the understanding of the geography at the time, they didn't understand how vast of a territory this is. And you can see they're granting him lands above the Rio Grande that nobody's even walked across yet from a European's perspective. He did have some experience going up to the Rio Grande and carried out a few punitive raids, but nothing really in depth. Now, seeing others before him had laid this vast territory that stretched all the way from Florida, as I mentioned, from Tampico and Veracruz all the way up. With this vast territory, the crown says, maybe we shouldn't give this to one person. Maybe viceregal authority needs to come in and step in. And King Philip II and his ministers agreed, and so this new kingdom was established. Carival was given some authorities under the viceroy, but the viceroy was keeping a pretty steady hand. And again, overall, this territory is about 244 square kilometers. And it's nowhere near Florida, as we can imagine, something that Carival was interested in. Most importantly, out of this territory, for the story of Texas and its missions, one of the cities that was established was Monclova, along with Saltillo and Monterrey. And those cities later on will serve as the basis of operations for expeditions north. But before any organized expeditions could go forth across the Rio Grande from these lower points, focus again shifted west. With the expansion of western pathways, a Camino Real leading from Culiacan into New Mexico, that becomes the focus again. And there's a renewed effort to take over New Mexico, where Coronado had failed. And the guy that's chosen for that is Juan de Oñate. And even in modern times, Oñate has become a controversial figure, and there's a lot of documentation out there and documentaries about some of the modern things that have gone on with his representation in the New Mexico community. But Oñate steps up in 1598, and he's told to go into New Mexico and try to look again for the Cibola and the Gran Crivera and conquer New Mexico. He goes forth into New Mexico, again, like everybody else. He doesn't find any large amounts of wealth. What he does find is the Pueblos who are going to be rebellious and the Hopi people who are going to be rebellious against Spanish control. It gets pretty brutal. At one point, a group of native peoples is rounded up, and they're being persecuted because they don't want to become Catholics. And Juan de Oñate drops the hammer. It's pretty brutal. At one point, he's called back to Mexico by the viceroy, and he will be relieved of his command. And they'll say, remember those royal decrees that were put forth, peace by purchase. We want missionaries to take the lead. We want to try to establish communities and not just necessarily conquer by the sword. Now, settlement by salvation, while using the sword sparingly, would continue in New Mexico after Oñate is taken out. And by the 1630s, almost 25 missions had been established in New Mexico. And the success of this mission strategy ebbed and flowed. But by 1680, tensions were building up again. And of course, we have one of the most influential revolts in North American history, or history overall, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And the Spanish are completely caught off guard by this. They don't expect the native peoples in this area to be as organized as they are. And in a pretty large singular push, the Spanish are forced out of New Mexico down to the Rio Grande, basically where El Paso is today. And it's going to be about where El Paso is that all these refugees from the Spanish settlements begin to congregate. And they're trying to see what's going to happen next. So while royal authorities marshaled forces to try to take New Mexico, again, many of the settlers had, again, congregated near this area of modern-day El Paso. Now, some decided to abandon this venture altogether. We're going to go south. We're going to go back below the Rio Grande. Forget anything north of the Rio Grande or the Rio Concho. We're going to stay in below. Others said, hey, this area is not too bad. And so they begin to settle up shop there. At the same time where the Spanish are reeling from this, the missionaries had done their job. And they began to make connections with the local indigenous populations, including one group called the Jumanos. And the Jumano peoples approached some missionaries in the 1620s and said that they had an interaction with a woman in blue. And that's going to be our sister here to the left. And talking about translocation, that there is a sister in Spain that's transported herself into the New World and taught these Native American peoples about the Catholic faith, and it gets a lot of coverage. In the fact, the leader of the Franciscans in the New World will actually go to Spain to interview the sister. And with that, the door has been opened to the going east through New Mexico, through Texas. And so now the missionaries are saying, how come we can't just refocus our shift instead of going north into Mexico, but west, or east, excuse me, into this Tierra Incognita, into what will become Texas. Now, the Spanish knew of different tribes and peoples to the east. Early explorers such as de Vaca and Carval had encountered people along the Rio Grande and the Gulf Coast. But no major settlements were mentioned. There was no grand cities. But the Jumanos had also mentioned a pretty wealthy tribe, a well-established tribe to the east, who they referred to as the Tejas. And further south, expeditions were also being launched, mainly with the goal of suppressing native raids, and they had begun to swing below the Rio Grande. Apaches, later on we'll have Comanches doing the same thing, and so a few military expeditions are sent to the Rio Grande. In 1675, one expedition, headed by Fernando de Bosque and his religious counterpart, Father Juan Larios, of just 10 soldiers and about 2 missionaries, go ahead and cross the Rio Grande, and they make a report saying, this is a fertile land for us to establish missions. But the Crown is not interested in pursuing that quite yet. And so what happens is, in 1682, instead of crossing the Rio Grande necessarily, they get close to the border, and one of the earliest missions in Texas is established, and that's going to be the mission and town of Corpus Christi de Isleta. And this is now the idea of the Spanish mission system has been brought into Texas. And that's from a recent trip that Colby and I went on, and we were able to tour the grounds, and it's a really fascinating place. And I recommend anybody who wants to make the drive out there to go ahead and do it. Beautiful country. Now, from this point in the story, one could guess that these entries alone across the Rio Grande at these different points at El Paso, a few entries that we've had over here in the south, punitive raids. Of course, we've had some entries over here when de Vaca had come in, and so naturally the Spanish are going to move into Texas. Now, and you'd be correct to guess that. That's going to happen. But how it happens is a little different than you may think. It's not just a natural missionaries moving forward. It's going to be another military reaction. And so a much more exciting event spurs the Spanish into action, and that's going to be another French incursion into the Gulf Coast. Some things have happened in the early 1600s that are going to change the power structure in the Gulf and also, of course, in the United States, or what becomes the United States. Rivalries and wars on the European continent had far-ranging effects. Changes were coming to the power structure in the New World. From the European landing on the continent, tales of wealth and resources swarmed over Europe. Monarchs who had originally passed up on the opportunities to sponsor these initial voyages wanted to partake in this new venture. Whether their subjects were fleeing religious persecution, war, or even possessing a charter to establish colonies, several European nations were eyeing territory in the New World. Now, we are all familiar with the English landings at Roanoke in 1585, Jamestown in 1607, and of course the Pilgrims in 1620. And by 1670, England had laid claim as far south as modern-day South Carolina, which in the 1540s had been explored by the Spanish. The Dutch had in 1614 claimed portions of the mid-Atlantic states, New York being one of the northern ones. And as early as 1523, a Portuguese sailor by the name of Verrazano was in contract with Francis I, exploring the eastern seaboard, trying to find a colony for France. And by the 1540s, New France was being established in the north, in today's modern Canada. A few other European powers also ventured in looking for settlements in the New World, but most of them were actually spurred on by, just like Columbus, this idea of a waterway to the east, getting a trade route with China. And this would continue up until Lewis and Clark. They're still looking for this transcontinental waterway. Now, English colonies dominated the eastern seaboard. The English kicked out the Dutch, and the Appalachians formed this natural border that stopped them from moving west. So the British and the French would look for other places to expand. And we can see here that Jamaica ends up becoming under British control in 1655, and what becomes Haiti today is assumed by the French in 1625. That idea of the Spanish Lake is beginning to erode. And now their main opponents of the Spanish in the New World have bases of operation to get into the Gulf and Florida, or even Mexico if they want to be so bold. Now, the French strategy was simple. Create a few settlements to work as hubs for an extensive trade network with native peoples, and then expand further inland. That's Canada. In the early 1600s, Samuel de Champlain had explored the vast St. Lawrence River and established Quebec, the capital of that colony. Their combination of trade, alliance, and missionary work paid off, and French explorers were making their way along the Great Lakes, and soon they were to be told of a great river flowing south and west. Could this be a possible route to the east? In 1675, two men were commissioned to explore this possible route to the Pacific. Louis Joliet was a merchant, and Father Jacques Marquette was a missionary, sort of following that Spanish model. And they were sent across the Great Lakes to try to find where this great river was. Now, they were successful in finding this river. But talking with natives in the area and doing their own scientific measurements, they realized that this river goes south, but it's not going to go east. It's not going to be a way to the Orient, but it's going to be a way to the Gulf. And so they returned back and made a report to the Governor General of New France, Louis de Baude, who is the Comte de Frontenac. And this is our good friend Frontenac here on the left. The Comte de Frontenac was ambitious and extravagant. You can tell by that nice feather in his cap over there. He had petitioned for this post in New France to stave off a debt. Collectors were going to take over his estate in France, and he said, "I'll do whatever you want me to do that I don't get foreclosed on." And the King Louis XIV says, "Well, we're going to send you to the New World." And he goes, "I am your man." So he goes. Now, in 1663, direct control of Canada had been put under royal authority. So he was 100% working for the king. Now, war is expensive, and for many years the French had been fighting against the Habsburg Empire, of which Spain was a part. The king needed to find a way to recoup the massive amount of money being spent, and he looked towards his colonies in the New World to do that. Sounds familiar to the United States later on in the British. Now, New France was going to foot some of the bill, but unlike the Spanish holdings, there's no vast wealth in metals that are found in Canada. No silver, no gold, nothing like Cortez and other Spanish had found in Mexico City and Zacatecas. Lesser metals could be found, but it was the pelts that made the wealth in New France. Now, despite having expansionist views that fit with the crown strategy of reaping these benefits, Frontenac was frequently at odds with the crown. And what happened is an issue with scheduling. Frontenac is dispatched to the New World. He has authority in the name of the king to do anything he wants. You want to fire somebody, you want to hire somebody. As long as you're not breaking the rules that we have set, you're good to go. but that's mainly for the establishment of towns and military things. There's a civilian counterpart to Frontenac who's a little bit late for his boat. And so what happens is Frontenac gets there first and he goes, you know what, I'm just going to be in charge of everything. And so he begins to butt heads with his civilian counterpart, and that transfers over, and he's even fighting with the king at one point, and even the Comptroller General of France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who's the minister of the colonies. Now, throughout the political upheaval surrounding Frontenac's governance of New France, he did find some allies in the new colony, and one of those was the gentleman over here, René Robert Cavelier de La Salle. Now, La Salle ends up in Canada because he's entering into a monastery. He's going to join a religious order and says, maybe this life isn't for me. And so he decides to join his brother in the New World, and he arrives in 1667. Now, upon arrival, he became obsessed with trying to find a way to the Far East. Matter of fact, tongue-in-cheek, everybody kind of makes fun of his country estate, and they call it China, because he's just constantly looking for a way. And to his credit, he's actually one of the first people to use a sailing vessel on the Great Lakes. So he has experience exploring. He also has an experience for spinning some yarn. Now, one of those expeditions is possibly finding the Ohio River, which is a big, big deal. Now, it was upon the return from one of those expeditions, possibly the one to the Ohio River, that La Salle had heard about Joliet and Marquette's discovery of this large river, the Mississippi. And maybe this was his chance to make a great discovery of his own. It was obvious that the river did not go east, but what it did offer was a chance to gain rights to wherever the river may lead to. He would take this proposed plan to the Crown, and in May of 1678, he received approval to explore whatever lay between Florida and Mexico following this river south. And on February of 1682, his company of about 37 altogether, comprised of both Europeans and Native Americans, arrived at the mouth of what he called the Colbert River, which is the Mississippi. And by the April 9th of the same year, they had reached the mouth of the river at the Gulf of Mexico. And we have King Louis XIV and his minister Colbert. And here's La Salle completing his mission in 1682, establishing a pillar, saying this is now French territory. And it was here that La Salle gave the land its enduring name, Louisiana, and claimed the vast land for the king with these words: I, René Robert Cavelier de La Salle, by virtue of his majesty's commission, which I hold in my hands, and which may be seen by all whom it may concern, have taken and do now take, in the name of his majesty and of his successors to the crown, possession of the country of Louisiana, the seas, harbors, ports, bays, adjacent strait, and all the nations, peoples, provinces, cities, towns, villages, mines, minerals, fisheries, streams, and rivers within the extent of the said Louisiana. What is the said Louisiana? Pretty much everything that's blue below the Great Lakes. Gigantic. Again, no sense of what that geography actually means, except with the hope that it has a lot of resources coming with it. But the most important thing that we can gain from this map is right here. Spanish, New Mexico, this Texas, Tierra, Incognita, and Mexico here, and Florida. The wedge has been driven between these two territories that the Spanish had continually tried to fight to keep whole. Now, immediate reaction to La Salle's great discovery of the river at the mouth of the Mississippi River was not met with huge applause or reward by King Louis XIV. La Salle's patron in New France, Frontenac, had been replaced, and the new governor, Lefebvre de la Barre, receives a letter from King Louis XIV about La Salle's discovery, and it says, "The Sieur de La Salle's discovery is completely useless. Such undertakings must in the future be prevented." So, good job, La Salle. And this apparent disregard for the discovery did not deter La Salle all that much, and he decided, you know what, I'm going to go petition the king to get another chance at this, and possibly to establish a river at the mouth, establish settlement at the mouth of the river. At this point, they're calling it the Colbert River. Soon that'll change. I think he's trying to grease the wheels, and he begins to call it the St. Louis River, after his sovereign. Now, his time at the arrival of the French court also afforded La Salle an opportunity to make a new powerful ally in his cause, and that's going to be the Abbé Claude Bernau. Now, Bernau was an influential member of the French court and happened to be pushing for a possible incursion into Spain's territory on his own. And what's going to happen is a shifty character shows up in the court in New France, Diego Dionyso de Penalosoa, and he had been banished from New Spain after his governorship of New Mexico on charges of blasphemy. And the Spanish Inquisition is still going on, and so if you don't like somebody politically, say they're a heretic and get them out of office. And so he shows up with a plan to land a force at the Rio Grande and invade Mexico from that angle. Now, King Louis XIV is saying, I do want more than pelts. I want silver and gold, but I also don't want an outright war with Spain. We're kind of on this peace track. I want to keep it that way, but maybe establishing this colony in Louisiana is the best route to go. And also, can I trust this Spanish outcast? Is he really an agent for Spain? And so what he does is he decides to take up La Salle's plan. And here we see an image of the ships that La Salle has under his command. Now, the Marquis de Seignelay, who is the king's minister of colonies at this time, reaches out to La Salle and says, your petition has been accepted, and they provide 4 ships, 2 more than originally given, the Le Joli, Le Amiable, La Belle, and the Saint-François. And on July 24th, 1684, the ships set sail from France. About 280 people altogether, and we're talking religious folks, soldiers, families, women, all kinds of individuals. And if you're lucky enough to go down 35 to the Bullock Museum, you'll see the La Belle there and the immense collection of items that it has inside its cargo hold. The French were going to establish a colony. They weren't just doing an experiment, they were there to stay. And the voyage itself was a reckoning to things to come. It was a disaster from the beginning. The admiral and La Salle on this expedition do not agree with each other. La Salle gets sick and almost dies at one point in Santo Domingo, and eventually they continue on. Sailors in Santo Domingo warn them of the Gulf Stream and how it's going to push them off, but La Salle says, no matter, I know where I'm going, I've been there before, I don't need directions, and they get lost. We've all heard that, I don't need directions. Now his latitude in 1682 of the Mississippi River was calculated at 27 degrees, which was off by 2 degrees, or nearly 140 miles, noted by modern scholars. And he also thought that this river was closer to the Rio Grande, so closer to Mexico. And that was kind of a selling point to the king, like, hey, if we set up the settlement, we could possibly do a military incursion into Mexico if you'd like. But by February of 1685, the French expedition had landed, and he's about 500 miles off of his objective. But nonetheless, salvaging what they can, materials from shipwrecks and all the things like that, they begin to establish a place called Fort St. Louis. Again, shout out to the king, hopefully to get some more funds. Now, Bijoux would return to France. He'd write a letter saying, I left the colony and I don't think it was doing well. There were some guys who decided not to continue on in Santo Domingo, and they probably have a little bit too much rum and begin talking to other sailors in Santo Domingo, and the Spanish begin to hear about this. We can see an idea of what Fort St. Louis would have looked like. Now, Spanish authorities acted quickly, and by the first week of January 1686, the Spanish fleet, under the command of Admiral Baroto and Romero, left from Cuba searching. 6 total naval expeditions would be sent out to try to look for La Salle. Can't find them. They send 2 to 3 overland, and finally the overland expeditions will be successful. Now, the reason why they can't find La Salle is he's going up a creek, and so he's more inland. Now, some of the Spanish flotillas do find wreckage of the ships, and they think that somebody must be somewhere, but they can't find any direct connection to La Salle. And so we see later on, the Spanish do find him. Now, in 1688, the crown appointed Alonso de Leon to command an expedition to locate the colony. Now, this time he had a slight advantage. With the expansion of the Spanish presence on the Rio Grande and interactions with native peoples, some of the native peoples begin to talk about a Spaniard they've encountered. And the Spanish are saying, what are you talking about? We don't have anybody over there right now. Well, the Native Americans are referencing some of the French that have left LaSalle's expedition. And matter of fact, one of them is captured. One of the names in the record changes multiple times is Jean Jaurès, and he, again, is still a little bit of a mystery. Jaurès is captured, brought to Mexico City, and said, how'd you get here? What are you doing, and where are your friends? And Jaurès says, I'll help you as much as I can, just don't hurt me. Well, the Spanish say, all right, well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to lead this expedition as a guide to find your fellow countrymen. De Leon's force had about 114 men, including some missionaries, and the head of the missionary contingent was a Father Damien Massenet, and he would go ahead and accompany De Leon on the expedition. Now, they retraced some of their steps that they had previously taken, and on April 22nd, along Garcitas Creek, the remains of a settlement are found. They have found Fort St. Louis. It is decimated. They find the remains of some individuals there. Everybody else that had survived had been dispersed, but where's LaSalle? Well, he had been killed, along with his nephew, while trying to get back to Canada. So we talk about the misinformation on geography at the time. I would never attempt to walk from Matagorda Bay to Canada. That's just me. But they think it's a lot shorter distance, so they're trying their best. Overall, about 15 individuals had survived out of that initial group that set sail to Texas. Now, the Spanish had completed their objective. They found the French settlement. They destroyed what they could. And now, one of the benefits to this was this interaction repeatedly with Native Americans in the area. So De Leon and Massenet form up a report. They send it to the viceroy that we should go ahead and go forth into this new land. And the viceroy says, okay, well, we'll think about it. And Massenet begs and says, please, can I get a chance to go now? And so Massenet is allowed, and in 1690, De Leon accompanies him to establish a mission along the Tejas people. And so the Tejas are open to this trade. They're open to creating this relationship with the Spanish at the time. And so they found a mission in Far East Texas, Mission San Francisco de los Tejas. They stay for a few days. Massenet organizes everything, and then him and De Leon go back towards the Rio Grande, disagreeing on pretty much everything along the way, including how many soldiers should be left behind, what kind of logistical needs are there. Massenet is very weary of any military presence among the missions. He doesn't want it. De Leon says we need to make missions, or we need to make fortresses in Texas at every major river, butting heads all the way back to Mexico. Just for an example, De Leon wants to leave 50 men at the mission. Massenet only allows to 3. So there's the issue we have here. And we can see some of LaSalle's adventures in North America, including the last one, ending up here at Fort St. Louis on Matagorda Bay. This is a recreation, some of you may have seen this, of Mission San Francisco de los Tejas at the state park. Now, a change comes again in the form of government, and De Leon is out. Domingo Terán de los Rios assumes the title of governor of the new province of Texas, and he'll assist Massenet in going back into Texas and helping to re-outfit the mission that is established there. But there's some issues going on. The Tejas attitude has changed towards the Spanish. They're not interested in any further interactions. They're people of their own. They have their own religion. They have their own culture. They have their own identity. They're not interested. Also, of course, interaction with Europeans. There was some disease trading going on, and so the Tejas people suffered from some of those interactions. With those unfavorable reports of this expedition back to help the mission, it's decided by the viceroy that no longer are they going to do expeditions into East Texas. But activity along the Gulf Coast once again shifted Spanish focus. Later on, a French explorer establishes a settlement at Biloxi to try to pick up where LaSalle left off. The Spanish had countered that by making efforts to establish forts at Pensacola, and so we see how the Spanish and the French are kind of going tit for tat over who's going to control the Gulf Coast. Now, a new administrator is sent to Biloxi on behalf of the French, and his name is Louis-Jean Jussier de Saint-Denis. Now, Saint-Denis is an explorer, kind of like LaSalle, and he had spent time navigating the rivers of Louisiana and became well-versed in native tongue, and so he's saying, I'm going to be a good fit to help administer this new colony, and the French government agrees with that. Now, he's working for the new governor of Louisiana, Anton de la Mothe de Sierre de Cadillac. So if you have a Cadillac, that's where it comes from. Now, Cadillac's plan was less martial but more economical. What he's going to do is he's going to say, why don't we use trade to go ahead and influence what's happening here and infiltrate Spain that way. And he decides to go ahead and maybe use Saint Denis and his knowledge to infiltrate the Spanish. With the closure of, and here we have Cadillac and Saint Denis over here. What's going on after that last Spanish entrada where they're not allowed to go back in, missions had been established by 1700 along the Rio Grande, one of them being San Juan Bautista. Now, on one of these expeditions, two Franciscan friars go forth and they want to go back. They have to go back. And one of them, or both of them, Father Francisco Hidalgo and Father Antonio de San Buenaventura y Olivares say we have to petition again. Olivares will go to Spain to try to petition. Hidalgo will do something else. He's waiting for a response from the crown, and he does something that's borderline taking his life into his own hands. He says, if the Spanish crown won't do something about this and they won't allow us to go back, I'm going to go ahead and write the governor of Louisiana. He writes a letter in 1711 to Cadillac saying, if the Spanish aren't going to help us, our countrymen aren't going to help us in this religious mission, then perhaps you will. And Cadillac, just when he's thinking about how to infiltrate Spain, gets this letter from this missionary. And he says, voila, this is how I'm going to do it. And he goes ahead and outfits Denis with trade goods overland. Now, Cadillac had already tried that, sending a mission to Tampico with goods, and they're turned around and told to go away. But Saint Denis bumbles through Texas and eventually ends up on the Rio Grande at San Juan Bautista. Father Olivares had returned, and in 1700, he petitioned to also make a mission on the banks of the Rio Grande. And this document here is that request, and it is in our collection at the Alamo today. It's one of the pieces that inspired me to kind of delve into what's happening here, because you're reading about why these people want to make these missions, establish them, and go further on into this unknown land. And by 1714, Denis arrives on the border. He's arrested, of course. He's housed as a prisoner in the commander of the Presidio, Diego Ramon's home. And him and Diego Ramon hit it off pretty well. They become good friends. Saint Denis also becomes good friends with Ramon's daughter and confesses his love for her. Whoa, didn't see that one coming. And so when Saint Denis is sent to Mexico City, he also uses that charm on the viceroy and says, I just was here to trade some goods. I didn't even know there was an embargo. My bad. I'll go back to Louisiana. And the viceroy says, yeah, you'll go back to Louisiana, but you're going to help us first. And you're going to help us get there and make sure that there's no French settlements in the area. But now the Spanish are tuned back into a possible French threat, and so Hidalgo's gamble paid off. Now, he gets a pretty big scolding from the authorities. They're saying, you basically committed treason to get this done. Hidalgo says, forgive me, and they say, fine, and they begin to establish missions in East Texas. And by 1716, several missions and presidios had been established in East Texas. And by 1770, a few more, including presidios, had also been created. Now, as with the missions established before, they also suffered a similar fate. Long distances of logistic resupply, overall health of the missionaries and the natives, and renewed threats of French invasion causes the Spanish to kind of leave those missions on their own. And they begin to realize they have to pull back. The Spanish crown also sees that they cannot leave a gap from the border of Louisiana to the Rio Grande. There has to be something there to stem and to hold the line. And so Father Olivares had been reflecting after his return to Spain on what to do. Now, in 1708, when Olivares and Hidalgo went on their initial voyage into Texas, they crossed over a river that in the 1691, matter of fact, had been christened by by Terán de los Ríos as the Rio San Antonio de Padua, so the San Antonio River. And it never left Olivares' mind. And he said, that's where my mission should be. And so one of the reasons why this document means so much to me and interested me so much is he packs up his mission, San Francisco Solano, and by 1718 establishes it along the banks of the San Antonio River and has to rechristen it San Antonio de Valero. And so this is the birth certificate of what becomes the Alamo. Now, he arrived on the banks about 1718 in May, and the land was granted to him by the governor of Texas, Martin de Alarcón. And I mentioned that they name it Mission San Antonio de Valero after the viceroy who had agreed to this establishment. Now, Mission Valero would hold the line of the Spanish experiment and would serve in its mission duties until secularization in the 1790s. On its site, a military garrison would find a new home in about 1804 and give it a new name, the Alamo. 118 years after its refounding, or its new founding on the San Antonio River, a legendary battle would take place there, one that we're in the middle of commemorating right now, the siege and the Battle of the Alamo. From there on out, the mission church and the old convento would serve as silent sentinels to the changes that came over time. From a small Spanish mission, an iconic battlefield, and now it sits in the heart of the 7th largest city in the United States. And so we can see how over time there is a common thread. One of the things that the mentors that I get to work with, like our curator Ernesto and Colby here, have taught me and our colleagues is that history is all connected. And so I hope this presentation today kind of gives you different ideas on how we can look at the Alamo and maybe give you a little more of a backstory on how we got to the establishment of Mission San Antonio de Valero. And I know that was a winding way to get there, kind of like the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast. And I hope nobody got lost like LaSalle either on our journey together. But I thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon, and any questions, I'm glad to answer them. Thank you.